As discussed previously with the Halo Infinite sandbox analysis, in multi-layered sandboxes, the sandbox elements can belong to 2 or more categories. For example, in Metal Gear Solid 5, the sandbox can be classified as non-lethal or lethal, as well as being classified as weapons dependent on accuracy and weapons that are more so dependent on stun effects or area of effect damage. Lethals potentially kill, adding demon points, and are more likely to alert the enemy when shots make contact. And they leave behind some bothersome corpses. However, they also do environmental damage, eliminate the risk of enemies waking up alerted, and can be used against non-human threats. Non-lethals do not kill, ensuring heroism gains, leaving less alerting bodies that sleep rather than bleed, and tie directly into the base building / extraction gameplay loop. But they are countered by armor, except for shotguns. They can't damage non-organic sandbox elements, and always leave the possibility that enemies will wake up and alert their friends. Accuracy-dependent weapons can reach longer distances, tend to suppress better, but they are harder to use in combat. Area of effect / stun weapons are usually louder and harder to suppress, have less range, but are great for putting down an alerted enemy base. An example of how you would put together a loadout while keeping both of these different categories in mind would be using the magazine-fed shotgun as your lethal area of effect, keeping it there for combat situations or high-tense stealth situations. The MD2000 non-lethal would be an accurate tool. The non-lethal Burkov could be used to supplement the MD2000 for closer ranges. And then couple this together with the blast arm that allows you more of that lethal area of effect type damage at longer ranges. If you think about it, even the buddies serve as sentient weapons that allow the player to balance out their loadout even further. If the player wants to do an all lethal loadout, an all close range loadout, and then have quiet use a long range non-lethal, they can do that. The buddies allow even more experimentation and playing around with how you balance all of these multiple layered categories. But a sandbox refers to more than just the weapons that you use. If anything, the justification for the weapons and how they work can be defined by looking at the enemies in a given game. In Metal Gear Solid 5, you have enemies that justify a whole bunch of different types of playstyles. Enemies too are multi-layered, both in the categories that they come in, but also the variations in said categories dependent on the way that the AI tries to counter the player and their strategies. For example, you have your standard guard. The starter standard guard is quite simple to maneuver around. There's a whole bunch of ways you can go about this. You can trank them, you can shoot them, you can CQC them, you can gas them, whatever you want. Or you could use the cover of night to slip by them. However, depending on what you do, these enemies will upgrade themselves. You'll get shotgun variants that make close range combat a lot more difficult. You'll get shielded variants that make area of effect or a hail of bullets a lot less effective since they have a shield to hide behind. You have rocket wielding enemies that can take down vehicles or certain buddies that require you to mount them. You have certain levels where there are children. You're not allowed to kill children in this game, so that requires you to switch up your playstyle if you've been going lethal to a more non-lethal or stealth-oriented playstyle. If you gas your enemies all the time, they'll start using gas masks, which will make them impervious to everything that you throw at them, forcing you to change up your strategy. If you keep on infiltrating at night, they'll use night vision goggles, negating that darkness advantage that you had. And of course, if you're tranking them a lot, they'll start putting on light armor, helmets, vests, things that stop your trank bullets and require you to use those accuracy-dependent weapons if you're going non-lethal, or to commit to a stun or area of effect weapon non-lethally, like the shotgun. Or, if you really want to counter this in the most efficient way, just use a lethal type weapon. That, at the very least, even if it's stopped by this armor, can make follow-up shots a lot easier than a lot of its non-lethal counterparts. You have your armored Juggernauts, which will come if you're playing very aggressively. These guys negate most damage, except for stun and area of effect. So if you try to use a lethal or non-lethal sniper, or other accuracy-dependent weapons, you're not going to do anything to these guys. However, if you're using a shotgun, grenade launcher, or rocket launcher, or some of the certain types of grenades, you'll be able to take these guys down. They come in two different variants, the shotgunner, which again discourages close range combat, and the LMG carrier, which is more of an upgrade to the assault rifles that enemies carry. The sniper type enemy makes it a lot more difficult to infiltrate a base, since their cone of vision is much wider than the rest of the enemies. If you start taking these guys down ahead of time with non-lethal weapons, they'll start wearing light armor, requiring you to focus more on shot placement, or just go more so aggressive with area of effect. The vehicles serve as one of the non-organic enemies in the game that cannot be taken down by your stun weapons. If you don't want to destroy them, you'll have to extract them. Vehicles come in many different shapes and sizes. You have the tanks, your Humvees, your artilleries, and your choppers, which serve as long-range powerhouses, capable of killing the player in only 2 shots with some of these vehicles. They all need to be countered by very heavy, hard-hitting, area of effect damage weapons, grenade launchers, rocket launchers, grenades, that sort of thing. Although the chopper tends to be slightly weaker. If you want to use more so of a precision-based weapon like an anti-material rifle or a powerful assault rifle like the AK, you can to take these things down. There's also some vehicles that just serve to armor up enemies or make them more mobile and harder to hit, such as the trucks and the pickup truck carriers. Either way, when you come across one of these things, it's a very different gameplay experience to what you would be facing with the standard infantry. The walker gears serve as a middle ground between vehicles and infantry, sharing a lot of the traits of both, as there's an infantryman riding it exposed at the back. However, the front is an armored vehicle. So depending on how you choose to go about this, you can use an accuracy-dependent non-lethal weapon and hit the guy in the back, or you can do more of an area of effect lethal weapon to take down the walker gear. Animals are interesting because they are organic enemies, however they act very differently from infantry. So for example, your wolves and your jackals will go down quite easily, but they will move a lot faster. Sheep and goats are really just there if you want to rack up demon points, or extract them to get some hero points. And then of course bears serve as sentient tanks. Except this time around, you can't hit them with those non-lethal weapons. But like those tanks or those choppers, they'll take a lot of damage before they go down. Gun ciphers return from Metal Gear Solid 2 and are just as interesting to fight. You don't have shaft grenades in this game, so when you go up against them, you have to use a lethal type of weapon. Now, which one you use is entirely up to you, but they change up the gameplay enough to justify the existence of non-lethal weapons in the sandbox, as if you try to shoot one of these things with a non-lethal weapon, you're not going to have a good time. Then you have your traps like landmines and lasers that require or justify sniper scopes or your int scope to survey the land, which again ties directly into Metal Gear Solid 5's gameplay loop of survey, infiltrate, extract, and then exfiltrate. This really makes it a requirement to take your time and survey the base before you just go waltzing in, otherwise you might trigger an alert. Cameras are like gun ciphers, except they are fixed in a certain position, and again, like the gun ciphers, they really justify having a lethal weapon to destroy them. Then of course you have your boss fight type enemies, mostly the skulls that come in melee, rifle, and sniper form, and they serve as just heightened versions of that regular infantry, and make it so that you can use those more so aggressive type weapons like LMGs, grenade launchers, and rocket launchers against infantry, because with the skulls, if you try to go at them and CQC them, you can counter attacks, but you'll never be able to just pick one up and toss it. So it really throws a wrench in the gameplay if you're a CQC maining player. And then of course the Metal Gear boss fight is just a great way to justify having rocket launchers, grenade launchers, anti-material rifles. It's essentially like all the tanks and choppers on steroids. So I've said before that Metal Gear Solid 5 is a level up system, and I stand by that, both with the weapons and with the enemies. Your weapons level up and get stronger, and your enemies level up and get stronger with you to keep that challenge alive. With the guns specifically, they level themselves up, however they get replaced by superior alternatives. Take a look at the sniper category, for example. The Renov non-lethal is your go-to trank sniper, and levels itself up to get more accurate and more powerful. However, once you unlock the MD2000, it replaces the Renov trank very quickly. Enemies level up not just by changing their weapons or their outfits or their armor, but by also introducing new enemy types that aren't based in infantry like vehicles or gun ciphers to challenge you more and limit the strategies that you can use on them. There are some single-purpose elements. For example, let's take a look at the assault rifle category. The MRS-4 sticks out as being the modular stealth weapon out of all the assault rifles. The AK ends up differentiating itself by making itself much stronger than all of its counterparts. The UNRC ends up becoming that non-lethal assault rifle. And the G44 differentiates itself from all of them by eventually being upgraded to the point where it takes 9mm and therefore can carry significantly more ammo than the rest of the assault rifles. However, there's also a lot of supersize me in the sandbox. Examples of this would be the MD2000 and the Renov, the redundant as hell SMGs, and the placeless, honestly, LMGs that just aren't as good as assault rifles, nor are they as accurate as snipers, nor do they have the high enough fire rate like SMGs. They're just kind of there for the purpose of having enemies able to use a stronger weapon, but don't really serve much of a purpose to the player. So the inclusion of categories like LMGs or SMGs kind of makes the sandbox very bloated. However, all in all, the sandbox is pretty strong, in the sense that there are no one-shot kill enemies, stealth is challenging, and the level up system is mostly clear. But we can't wrap things up there, because there's still a lot of issues that I've already kind of touched on that still need to be brought up or have more focus put on them before we can wrap up this video. Non-lethals are too overpowered. Bolt actions barely need a scope. Semi-auto Burkov, the pump action non-lethal shotgun, suppressed are too strong. If Snake was weaker, this could be justified, but seeing as though CQC makes him an apex non-lethal predator, with no enemies being able to counter or negate CQC aside from the vehicles and certain skull encounters, CQC makes the addition of non-lethal suppressed semi-auto pistols or bolt-action rifles that work at close range that can be suppressed and non-lethal, or the pump-action shotgun that can take down fully armored opponents non-lethally and suppressed, way too overpowered. Enemy weapons, at least in their standard configuration, do piss poor damage, so at the start of the game, even though you are technically weaker, you're still significantly stronger than all of the enemies, and this makes combat less of a threat. Now, you might say, oh, but that's to make the gameplay a little bit more varied and justify a combat playstyle. Well, you also have the regenerating health. All in all, the player is too strong and the enemies are too weak, even when you level this stuff up. So even if I'm later on in the game and I'm taking hits by enemies, I can just go hide behind a barrier, recover my health, and go right back at it. If I'm running out of ammunition, I can just call more ammo from the sky. I can unlock certain outfits that make me more of a tank. Combat isn't really a threat since you're so able to prepare for it. But the biggest flaw with Metal Gear Solid 5 Sandbox is the gunsmith. It allows players to break the game very early on, making later unlocks inferior to what the player already has, and that breaks the level up system entirely. But let's not end this video on a negative note, because there are ways to fix this sandbox and make it supreme, on a level high up there with even something like Ground Zeroes or the Tanker mission. So the first solution to fix up Metal Gear Solid 5 Sandbox would be to make the gunsmith as an endgame unlock after unlocking all the other weapons. Make this something that we have to earn right at the very end that allows us to break anything we want, and at that point it's justified because we have gone through the grind of going through that whole level up system. So if anything, it's like a new game plus sort of feature. The enemies need a buff or a hard mode is needed.
Luckily for us, there are already 2 examples of how to bring in difficulty into a game like Metal Gear Solid 5, and those 2 examples can be found in Ground Zeroes and in Metal Gear Solid 4. In Ground Zeroes, there is a hard mode, where if you select it, all of a sudden the enemies become a lot more aware. The standard assault rifle can kill Snake in up to like 2 to 3 bursts, and the overall game experience becomes a lot more challenging as you start off the mission with a lot less on you. Something like this in the Phantom Pain would be phenomenal and solve a lot of the issues that we just talked about. But perhaps if I had a lot more creative control, a solution that we can see in Metal Gear Solid 4 is to have a health bar and some negative debuffs. The health bar is pretty obvious. I'm not a fan of the regenerating health in Metal Gear Solid 5. I find that it takes the combat of the Metal Gear series that's always been known for balancing out consequences really well, either through healing items or something like the survival viewer in Metal Gear Solid 3. And then this whole self-healing just kind of gets rid of that. That's really shitty. I don't like that. A health bar would be phenomenal. Now, whether or not you want to include survival mechanics, maybe something streamlined, maybe with something that Phantom Pain already has, like the whole triangle to do these certain healing animations when you get really hurt, or burn through healing items. You know, because Metal Gear Solid 4, one thing that it does really well is during combat, you're only as powerful as the amount of healing items that you have. Of course, there is movement and cover to take into consideration, but the reality is, if you're in combat, you're probably going to get hit. And hits in Metal Gear Solid 4, on harder difficulties at least, really take their toll. So you need to scavenge the environment for health items and have them prepped and ready for when shit hits the fan. And since Metal Gear Solid 5 is an open world, scavenging for health items would fit right in. And then in regards to the debuffs, both Metal Gear Solid 3 and 4 feature a stamina or a psych meter, something that measures the state that Snake is in besides his health. Metal Gear Solid 5 kind of has something like this, where if you get hit too much or if you don't shower too often, your reflex mode is slower, you get the flies around you, and you know, your aiming is a little wobbly, but it's not nearly wobbly enough. These debuffs are there, but they're not enough to make the game really challenging. So making them more like Metal Gear Solid 4 and Metal Gear Solid 3, where if you're really not maintaining Snake's stamina or psych, he becomes a lot weaker and it becomes harder to deal with your enemies. But then there's also solutions for this difficulty or lack of difficulty in Phantom Pain that can already be found within the game. Take a look at the game's FOB mode, where there are ciphers, where the enemy guards are a lot more competent with armor and weapons, where there are traps that you have to avoid. Putting more of these into the open world would change up the gameplay, force you to diversify your strategy, and be good counters to CQC, because you can't really CQC a trap or a gun cipher now, can you? Adding that together with the other vehicles and stuff in the open world that you can't really use CQC against would make it so that it's a lot more balanced, because now you're not just the master of every enemy, but there is a further roster, not just in vehicles but also with the infantry, that keeps you from being that all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful predator. And of course, as a finishing note, like we mentioned before, trim off some of the fat, get rid of the SMGs and the LMGs, or rebalance the entire sandbox to make it so that there's less weapons that are redundant or don't really have a purpose. But yeah, in conclusion, Metal Gear Solid 5 is a multi-layered level-up sandbox. It's good, but it's flawed. It can come off as way too easy, there's a lot of excess fat, and there's a lot of design features that could have been done so much better, but all in all, it is a very fun game. The sandbox encourages diversification of strategy and exploration of its mechanics, and that's something you always want to look for. So don't misunderstand me, I'm not trying to write this off. It's just good. If you needed me to give it a grade, I'd probably give it a B+. But those are my thoughts on it, at least an overview. Let me know what you guys think down below. This has been Bliskin, over and out.